Well, good afternoon. I'm Drew Cox, and this is Rackspace Office Hours. I'm usually joined by co-host Alan Bush. He's out today, but I do have a guest with me, and this is Eric Johnson. Welcome aboard. And how are you doing today, Eric?
Thanks for having me. I'm doing great. I'm excited to be doing this.
Well, we're glad to have you. We've got a good topic today, something that we've touched on a few different times, and various topics through this conversation we'll have touched on in different platforms. But we're talking about serverless architectures today, and serverless is a pretty self-explanatory term. The definition's in the name, but I think a lot of times serverless architectures are at this point, at least for me, synonymous with tools like Lambda. And it does go beyond that, so we're going to get into some of the other ways you can approach your architecture with serverless components and thoughts. So that's kind of the gist of where we're going to be going with this conversation today. But before we get into it, Eric, why don't you set the stage a little bit with a little bit of your background and a little bit of an introduction?
Yeah, no problem. So, like you said, I'm Eric Johnson. I am the AWS Evangelist slash Cloud Architect for Rackspace. However, I have a background in development. Before I worked at Rackspace, I was a customer of Rackspace. I was a senior architect, full stack for a full stack JavaScript house. I love development. I love architecture. I love AWS. I love to speak about it. I'm kind of a nerd that way. But a lot of my background is development and figuring out how do you develop. It started out as how do you develop cheaper, then it became how do you develop easier, and so in order to do that, serverless just really caught my attention on both fronts.
Well, a lot of that is tied together. So
Yeah.
easier often means more quickly, and speed can be a huge component in cost. So it can definitely save you some headache, but it can also save you some money and get you to market faster. There's a lot of value wrapped up in ease of use. So those conversations, that's kind of a logical progression. Once you're in one camp, you're going to start thinking about the other one.
Yeah, that's correct. That's exactly right.
So you're piqued your interest there with serverless architectures. Why don't you go into a little bit of kind of where that started? Maybe your
Sure.
first your learning process. What was that first project on serverless?
Yeah, I kind of went at it a little differently. I think a lot of times people start with, and this is going to be very AWS centric, obviously.
Sure.
A lot of people start with I'm going to host on S3. And I knew you could do that, but I just never really messed with it. And all the architectures, I had worked with, we had servers up, we were just going to host it there, and the client and backend weren't separated enough for us to do that. But one day I was trying to work out how to deal with some backend stuff, and I started reading about Lambda. Lambda's really where I kind of got my first taste of serverless. And I got to be honest, I just fell in love with it. So with Lambda, I was able to take some work that we were doing, and we really just kind of had these one-off things that we didn't really want to wrap and build up a server for, wrap in an API or anything like that. We just had some quick things we want to do, which really is the basic definition of a microservice.
Mm-hmm.
We want you to handle this one little thing and handle that one thing really well, but I don't want to spin up a box to do that, and I don't want to have to maintain the scalability and reliability and all that stuff that goes with with spinning up EC2s or running an instance. So I started digging into Lambda. Now Lambda will run, I'm a Node guy, like I said, and Lambda will run Node, Python, or Java. But we dealt with a lot of Lambda. So I started climbing into, how do you develop? Of course, I come from an Express background where the full framework, all the routing is there, and so you definitely kind of have to change your mindset. There's a lot of fluff that comes with a framework like that gets peeled out when you're dealing with Lambda.
Mm-hmm.
With Lambda, it's straight up, here's the code. Get rid of all that other stuff. Get rid of all the, the routing, things like that. Just here's the code to run that one little bit of microservice that I need. And so that's kind of where I got started. And with that, it really kind of caught my attention. Man, this is really easy. I don't need to, auto scaling and elastic load balancing, all that's great, but if I don't have to do that, I'm not going to do that. And so I started looking at, well, all right, so where can I host my code? And like I said, I had done, I had heard of S3, and so I moved over to S3. But one of the things that I ran into is, most of what I build are spas. I use a framework, and a spa it's a single page application.
Mm-hmm.
Just for those who may not know this, in the web world, when you build websites, a lot of them are multi-page applications where one page, I hit click to go to another page, it goes back to the server, it gets to the next page and brings it down. Well, a spa works differently, and where it grabs the whole site down the first time, and then it's all kind of local there, and then it just gets updated with data as it needs it. And
Sure.
so it's a different kind of way of thinking. And there's a lot of routing happens there and different things like that. So I was trying to figure out, could S3 handle something kind of that complicated? And in truth, it does. I mean, literally, I thought I was going to write, and S3 offers some great tools. They offer the routing tools and different things like that. But to run a spa, I mean, it was literally just as simple as dropping my code in there, setting the index page and setting the error page to point back to the index page. So if it didn't find it, and it came up and it was running. And so at this point, I've got I'm hosting on S3, and I'm running my API on Lambda. The last thing I needed for this at this time was a database, and so DynamoDB. Now I'm a Mongo guy, and so. And I've heard a lot of people say, well, DynamoDB is just is Amazon's replacement to Mongo, and that is not true. It is a document database, and it's a NoSQL database. So in that respect, it is a replacement, but it's a different animal. I mean, it's a different kind of thing. So there was kind of a learning curve going on there, but those three tools allowed me to build an entire system without having to spin up one server. And when you host on S3, you get S3's elasticity immediately. There's no work to it. Same with Lambda. If you think about it, Lambda runs event-driven code. That's the whole idea, event-driven code, and it runs on one of their farms. They'll deal with all the servers. So that's kind of where I got involved in it.
Yeah, managing a bunch of stuff gets to be a problem. I've driven cars all my life, but recently I was at a point where there were 4 cars in my driveway, one of which didn't work at all, one of which was having some issues, and the other 2 were fine, but it was this big, hairy management problem of, I've got all this stuff, and all I need to do is get from point A to point B. And ideally, I could just use, mass transit, where someone else does all the maintenance and all that other stuff, and I can just hop on, a bus or a subway or some tool that the city provides that gets me from where I am to where I want to go. It'd be a lot less maintenance. Now, some of the fine-grained control of when exactly I want to leave and what I want to listen to on the speakers in my stereo in my car and some of those things, I would lose out on. But the maintenance and the upkeep and the oil changes and the insurance and all that stuff wouldn't be on my plate anymore. And so that's kind of my metaphor, my proxy in thinking about this kind of a conversation is, it's nice to have some of that full control and access. But at the same time, there's some headaches that you really may just not even think about because it's just the way you've been living your life. I've got to keep an eye on that odometer because eventually I'm going to have to get the oil changed. But once you pivot into using mass transit, somebody else has to fool with all that stuff. I just have to, keep an eye on what service is available where so I can get to where I need to go. And as long as you're getting the end result you're looking for, who really cares how it's getting done, especially if it's less work on you? Yeah. And so I think this whole conversation really is that parallel in my mind, and what helped me kind of set up the framework for why this is valuable was thinking of it in that way. And when you thought through, so to take one step back and to put some additional context around this, you wrote a series of blog posts that kind of walk through your implementation of what you just talked through. And so if you want to go to the Rackspace blog, we'll put the link in the show notes. But you can go to the Rackspace blog and check out kind of a step-by-step progression of how did I get from Amazon account to this functional serverless architecture. and the components that you leverage. So it's a nice walkthrough, talks through some of the philosophy as well as the actual implementation of these different components. And it takes advantage of things that we've talked about in previous shows. We had Martin Smith on to talk about Lambda kind of at a high level before, and we've talked about hosting a flat HTML page and things like that in cloud files here at Rackspace. And so those are kind of those foundational concepts that when applied at a wholly AWS solution get kind of bolted together in this more valuable way. So that's the high level impetus behind getting you, Eric, on this show, because you've put together a pretty clear walkthrough, a pretty clear template that you could check out the blog, start that process yourself, and get some value pretty quickly out of. But let's talk about what sorts of things maybe potential customers or existing customers could leverage these phases for themselves, so that they can start getting value out of these resources that they don't have to maintain themselves.
Okay. Yeah, so I think I would break the customers into a couple groups. The first person, it kind of goes back to what you were talking about earlier. First person I would talk about is the startup. If I'm a startup group and I'm beginning to develop, I'm getting put together, the last thing I want to deal with is putting together a DevOps team or an operations team or whatever. That's money, and money is, having just the company I worked for before was we were a true blue startup, and you run on as lean as you possibly can. And so if I were a startup and I were looking to choose my technical stack, honestly, I wouldn't look anywhere else unless I was doing something very specific that would not work on this. Kind of like, you were talking about the car. Mass transit's great unless you got to leave the city. You know what I mean? Then there's a lot of walking, and then it becomes a pain because you're trying to make all that happen. But the analogy works in the fact that I want to start. If I'm staying local, if I want to stay lean, if I want to run quick, I can as a development group, a startup development group, all I got to worry about is developing. There's this term that's going around, and it's been around for a while, but I love it. It's called infrastructure as code. As a developer running serverless architecture, that's what you basically have. If you look at AWS, well, kind of step back here. When I set up my work environment, one of the first things I'll do is I start building CloudFormation templates. And that seems really kind of like, oh, you do that first. Yeah, I do, because once I get those in place and I can build, and if you don't know what a CloudFormation template is, that's the magic behind automation in AWS infrastructure. That's going to spin up things. But the nice thing about it is I can create my Lambdas, I can create my user roles, I can create my identity pools, I can create, pretty much anything I use under serverless architecture as a JSON template in my code. So when I'm ready, I just, update the stack. It's a simple command line call. My stack is updated out on AWS, and then I can start pushing my Lambdas. I can move to another account. I can, whatever I want to do. And so as a developer in a startup team, if I understand that much, then I don't have to worry about, building out the infrastructure or anything like that. And so that is, again, as a startup, that's where I'd go first. As an existing, let's say an existing like Rackspace customer or existing company that has a monolithic or even a really well separated, partitioned architecture, one of the things I would be looking at is how can I start breaking some of those pieces out to get them off servers? Because even with AWS's mantra is pay for what you use. But the reality of EC2 instances are, even if I'm not using them at midnight, I still need them up. And so it's pay for what you use I'm using those services, but I may not be using my application. But the beauty of serverless is you now pay for what you use at a granular application level.
Right.
So
and this has been a constant drive. So you go from, I've got these servers in my building to I want someone else to handle them because I want to lose some of that management. Okay,
right.
now they're colo. Okay, well, now I want to chop that up in some virtualization format so that I can get more value out of that piece of hardware. Okay, now I don't want to host that. I want to go to a public cloud. So they chop it up, and I'll just take the one piece I need instead of having to figure out how to allocate all of this host. And then you go into Docker containers or some other solution that's even smaller and finer grained, and then you get into Lambda functions where someone else is handling a greater and greater portion of what is required for you to get your end goal delivered. And this is just kind of the most recent development along that path. And it seems inevitable that we got here, but now that we're here, it's pretty ridiculous the value you can get, the efficiency that drives.
That's right. Yeah, the evolution's been pretty cool. Just like you said, from internally, racks on stacks and systems on racks and things like that, to a granular level. And I honestly, and I wouldn't say, well, we can go no further because I'm sure we can. But honestly, I don't know where else you would go. I mean, how much more granular do you get than the actual event? And that's what Lambda runs off, is an event. And so, to drive that code. But I think that's a really smart setup, and I think when people look at that, they go, wow, and I actually hear this as I talk to companies, look, we just can't go serverless. Well, I agree, you can't go entirely serverless. A lot of people think, well, it's either all or nothing. Is there anything in between? And so for companies that are existing, I would definitely be looking at a hybrid solution.
Yeah, there's a couple of things you mentioned in the blog post that seem like really great places to start. I would imagine authentication is one of those that most people are going to need. So let's start there. Talk a little bit about how you can offload authentication to a serverless solution.
Yeah, so I use Cognito, and there's two parts of Cognito that you can use, and that's the user pools and the identity pools. And the cool thing about Cognito is really AWS does the work. If you're using that, they're going to do the work of handling session, different things like that. They've given you a JavaScript SDK that you can work with. And so if let's say I'm not even going to use AWS tools. I'm not going to use Dynamo. But I still want to secure my site. I can use Cognito to generate tokens so they're going to control all my user stuff. And Cognito kind of came around. It's kind of interesting, and Cognito wasn't really designed to authenticate on websites. And for those of you who don't know me well, these are quotes and not apostrophes. Let's just get that out there. And I also use this for any number I want it to be. So now that you know, if you're watching,
let's take a quick pause because we haven't. There's a lot of people watching in a lot of places.
Okay.
So there are ways you can interact with us. If you're watching on Facebook, leave a comment. YouTube or Google Plus, leave a comment. If you're watching on Periscope, let us know. Say hello. It looks like a lot of you guys are watching live on one of those platforms. The platform where you can actually see Eric is YouTube or Facebook, or no, YouTube or Google Plus. So we're on Hangouts there. And that's where you can see the entirety of this. If you're hearing a disembodied voice on one of those other two platforms, Eric is that disembodied voice. He has a body. You can actually see his shining face.
Plenty of me.
So you can see him in the digital flesh if you check us out on those other platforms. And thanks for watching live. We would appreciate your comments, feedback, and questions. We've kind of set the stage a little bit, and as we continue on and you have specific questions, please shoot them our way. But if you're watching this in the future because you catch this captured and living in the future on YouTube, send us comments that way. I've got my handle. I'd be happy to. So if you're watching us live, thanks. If you're watching us in the future, tell us how it is, and we're looking forward to hearing your feedback. But let's go shift back into what we're talking about there with some of those easy components to take as first steps into serverless when you've got an existing solution in place that's maybe not taken full advantage of those things built before that was really an option.
Okay, so back to Cognito, because we're talking about the authentication section of it. Cognito was actually built for and I can't say I know the mindset of AWS, but you can see it was very driven at mobile authentication and mobile synchronization. So one of the sweet things of Cognito is if I authenticate against Cognito, I can sync data across mobile. So you can say, there's my iPad. It's a gaming platform in a lot of ways where they can sync up data. But the beauty of it is I can use a web as well. And so I can actually store data, and then with the authentication, this is how it works with the user pools, is I store the data at the cognito level. And so my username, my email, different things like that, I can add custom attributes, different things like that, and I can sync those between devices, including a browser. And so by using user pools, I can do different applications, like different things. That will create that allows me to create authentication on a website, and you can stop there. You can say, okay, I've got what I need. You can add on. You have multi-factor authentication. In fact, I just implemented that on an application I'm building here for Rackspace, where when you register, you get a code on your phone and to register, and then I can run what's called pre-registration triggers against lambdas, which are just really cool. But basically, you're able to do pre-registration things like verify, is it a Rackspace email, or is it whatever you want to do. And then on login, the multi-factor authentication still works in that I log in, it pops back, it asks me for a code, and it goes in. And there you go. You've authenticated a website. But if that website's going to partake in AWS tools, then you get into identities. And the identities allows you to have an unauthenticated role and an authenticated role. So you can interact with this identities unauthenticated, and you can give it certain roles like, I can reset my password or register, things like that. And then you have an authenticated role, and that'll allow it to work with lambdas or invoke different things like that. So you basically have the whole gamut of authentication against AWS through Cognito, and you're done. But the nice thing is through Cognito, you can also use Facebook authentication, LinkedIn authentication, all kinds of federated providers. And so it really takes, if you've ever built an authentication system, and anybody who develops, at some point we've had to. Right. It's a nightmare. It really is, especially you get into the Java tokens and things like that, and JavaScript tokens. It gets really frustrating. So if I've got someone who does it well, and I'm a decent developer, but I'm going to guess there's some guys at AWS that are even smarter than me, and I'm going to let them deal with that and not reinvent the wheel. And so it's kind of out of the box with a lot of flexibility in it.
Well, this is something that we talk about on this show quite a bit. Is there's plenty of things that are possible for an individual to do. I mean, you can absolutely go and build your own authentication tool.
Right.
Someone else who does it professionally can do it, and you can leverage that experience.
Yep.
And that means it's probably built a little bit better than you'd be able to build it, and it's leverageable in a lot less time than it would take you to build it. And both of those things are really valuable. To have something that is more secure and stable is clearly valuable because of security and stability. But then to have something that's so quickly accessible means that's time you can apply other places. If you have a feature that you're dying to put out, but you've got to solve that problem first, solve it in a way that you're taking advantage of someone else's expertise and move back to the thing that's going to deliver you value for your customers. Your users are going to enjoy the feature probably more. It's more necessary to have authentication, but when you take advantage of someone else's expertise, that's going to accelerate your ability to deliver to the market. And that's something that from scaling that up a little bit further, Rackspace wants to deliver our expertise to our customers so that they can get things done for their businesses more quickly and not have to worry about those architecture components that, all those design conversations still need to happen, but a lot of them can happen at an expedited pace because you've got other experts who are bringing their experience in after trying to solve that problem 1,000 different ways, seeing the best, quickest, most useful tools. They can deliver those to the customer, and that project gets done that much more quickly. So that's really a through line in this show has been taking advantage of other people's expertise.
Well, that's plagiarism is the first form of flattery. I don't know if that's the right quote. I probably just slaughtered that, but I mean, in the open source world, in the development world, that's key. And it really from every angle, from cost factor, from time factor, if someone else has done it and does it well, it's worth. I mean, even if you pay for it, or even if it's worth looking at, because you have to evaluate how much time is it going to take me to do that. If I were to rewrite Cognito, that would take me probably a couple of years, to be honest. Because there's some expertise that they have that I don't. When I first wrote that authentication that I use in the blog, I actually have taken that, and that's written in a class that I've just got filed away. And every time I bring up a new application, I drop it in, and yeah, it's matured some, and I've added some things to it, but it's a good working authentication system that works with I use a framework called Aurelia for my front end framework, and it works really well with that. I just drop it in as a plugin. So.
Now we've got a comment from Periscope saying that rolling your own takes time and training overhead. That's the other thing. You've got to be up to speed on the tooling required to build the tooling you need, and that in and of itself. I mean, you can hack through forums and Google for answers and get there, but that takes time and frustration and all those other things as well. So that's a great comment. Thanks for jumping in.
I agree with that.
I think that was our main comment from Periscope. We'll get a few more of those in as we go, so keep them coming.
Okay.
But let's talk a little bit more about, we kind of hit the middle there with Cognito specifically.
Yeah.
That's one of the main topics in the second blog post, the middle piece there.
Right.
But let's go Silicon Valley and do middle out here and talk about some of the things that you open the conversation with in that blog, and serving content through S3.
Okay. So S3, there's a limitation obviously, and I'm not going to be able to run PHP there. I'm not going to be able to run Java. Anything that requires a back-end server isn't going to work obviously, because it's not a server, so to speak. It's a file system. Well, it's not really. It's an object storage system. And so, but anything that runs at the client, a la JavaScript, is fair game. The simplicity of S3 is, there's several reasons why I use it. Now one of the limitations is you really need to have your DNS, or at least some of it through Route 53, because you're going to need to alias that and set that up if you want to put a domain name on it. If I host something on S3, I'm going to get an AWS domain that's 7,200 characters long, and I can use that, but and I can even CNAME that. So I guess you could, but the better way to do that, obviously, if I'm using Route 53, alias it, and there you go. And so the beauty of this is, when I set up an architecture, I'm going to do mydomain.com. I'm going to have mydomain.com, which is my production. I'm going to have beta.mydomain.com. And I'm going to have maybe, I might have a development if we need it, or a staging or something like that. And those are literally just buckets. And if you know anything about S3 is redundant across zones. And so it's not just stored in one place. You can also version your code. If you don't want to deal with GitHub and you just want to upload directly, and you don't version there, which I don't know why you would. I mean, GitHub's a great product, and that's where I store all my stuff. But you can version on S3, and so you always have access to old versions of your code and new versions. And so what you're able to do is you say, I'm hosting this. I've uploaded something. Oh no, I just broke everything, and then I can go back and grab it. And it's not a specific rollback, so to speak. You have to kind of bring those forward, but you have those versions. So right there, you've got versioning, you've got redundancy, scalability. One of the things when we come into a large company, and one of the things we hear a lot is, we need scalability. We don't know what our traffic's going to be. So if you look at this from a standard architecture, we'll call it that, or a servered architecture, one of the things you deal with is auto-scaling servers back and forth. We're running with 4 servers. All of a sudden, we're spiking. Now I need 8 servers. And AWS is really good about spinning those up, but there's still a delay. There's still a time frame. With S3,
and setting all that up is still work that you have to do.
There's exactly. It's not a push a button and those are there. You have to understand what you're doing. With S3, if I'm hosting there and I go from 10 users to 10,000 users, AWS has got it covered. You know what I mean? I don't have to worry about spinning up boxes or anything like that. One of the things we talk about scalability is the user experience the same for 10 users as it is for 10,000, and in S3 it will be. And you can even get into, if you want to put in front of your S3, you can put a CloudFront, CDN on that, and then you've got, you can cache it, or put it out to different, obviously regional locations.
Well, one of the use cases that really plays well with is you've got customers, you've got a big event coming as a company, and
Right.
you've got your normal, here's my site, here's my application. It works really well in a site like an e-commerce situation where you're going to run a special or you're going to be featured on some show and you're going to get a lot of traffic. Leave that as is, and in front of that, put a splash page landing page that's cached on a
Yeah.
CDN so that it can stand up to a massive explosion of traffic, and buy yourself a little bit of time on the back end to drive that customer experience, but that engagement you're going to get, put that in front so that as that traffic and that engagement increases, that scales beautifully and just fine on the front end, and then you buy yourself that time with your auto scale tools to put the back end in place once those click-throughs happen and you've got people engaging, going to the shopping cart, things like that, and actually converting that interest into revenue. So we make those recommendations pretty consistently when we have big event-type customers coming to us, especially. I mean, it seems to make a lot of sense for e-commerce, and there's certainly other places that you can go, or situations you can find yourself in where there'll be valuable implementations of that type of a strategy. But you may not be building something that's just going to be compatible with S3. You may have a solution that requires a bunch of these other components, PHP and all that stuff. It still may be valuable to set something like that up in front of, to create that buffer that is that seamless, immediately scaling solution that's in place as a first line of defense to provide that seamless experience and buffer.
Yeah, no, I think it makes total sense. It's degrading nicely. So my servers, if my application servers can't handle it, I've at least got a page that's telling me, hey, we're catching up or something like that. I think that's really smart. That's always better than down servers.
Well, and then you've got the opportunity to have a seamlessly scaling error page that says, whoops, sorry,
That's right.
we're having some issues. But if it's branded, it still gives you a better face than 404 couldn't find. Sorry.
That's right.
So definitely useful in putting that professional face forward for your organization.
Yeah, that makes total sense. One of the questions I get asked about serverless is how do I, from an application standpoint, this kind of goes back to what we're talking about with S3, is how do I prepare my application? Because you're right, you've got to run on PHP, and one of the things, just from an architectural standpoint, from a development architectural, I encourage people when they build their websites, separate, client separated out, server separated out. Client hits the server as an API. Don't render, and I know that .NET people and Ruby people, they might be mad at me, but generally I don't render in .NET. I don't use the Razor engine. I don't use the different things like that. I render on client side and call just the data updates. And it doesn't have to be a SPA to do that. Your server can generate your HTML, if you want, but not if you're going to host on S3. On S3, you have to have just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. That's all it's going to handle. And so I encourage them, start separating out your application. And there's multiple reasons. Obviously that's great because then the same API can service your mobile front, your mobile backend, or whatever. So you got the central hub of your API and multiple clients, because nowadays web is just one client for an API. It's no longer just the web. Mobile is, if not, the most popular, very close.
It's a
when you look
juggernaut
at
for
stats. Sure. Yeah, exactly. And so by doing that, then I can say, okay, this particular client can sit on S3, and it's good to go. And really, I personally, anything new I build, there's no reason to not host on S3. That's kind of where I'm at. But if you're already out there, start separating out. And that's the first approach at kind of getting stuff onto S3, like a front end, like you said.
Yeah, it's a hard decision when looking at how do I want to adopt a new technology, of
Right.
identifying exactly where to start. And greenfield is usually the best option because
Yeah.
you don't have any of those contingencies that you're saddled with by doing something that you've already established. But there's not always that opportunity, and so looking
Right.
over your entire solution and finding those components that are a good first step is pretty important. And that's one of the roles that we fulfill here at Rackspace is looking at requirements and saying,
Mm-hmm.
it's working that way, but it would work more efficiently, or you could get more performance out of it if you make this change. And so having a conversation where you're talking through priorities, like at the end of the day, the most important thing for us is uptime or security or whatever your requirement is, gives us that context where we can say, I know you're telling us that you want to go this route, but with your requirements, it's really going to be valuable if you'll look at least taking this one piece this other direction. And you're an architect, that's part of what you do is have those
Absolutely, yeah.
conversations. And so for the purposes of this conversation, we're staying broad. We're talking about generalizations.
Right.
And for any of you watching who have specific questions, feel free to throw them out here. We may or may not be able to answer them specifically in this context, but you can also reach out to us after the fact, and we can have those conversations in over a phone call or something along those lines where it is very specific to your use case. But that does beg the question, how do I start doing this? And so let's go to phase 3. Let's talk a little bit about the third installment of your blog post and how you're taking advantage of Lambda in those microservices scenarios and some of that statelessness that's required to do this.
Absolutely, yeah. So when you build, I've got I'm hosting my code on S3. It's up and running, but I still need some type of server. I need some database. I need some logic. I need some things that
It's
are going to
dynamic.
happen.
It's not just that HTML.
Exactly. Yeah, I need Node. And so Lambda is the perfect drop point. I mean, that's exactly where it fits. And so basically, with Lambda, if I need something, one of the things that I did in the example was PDFing. I need a document PDF'd. And this kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier, where's a good place for me to start? One of the first places, and I'm going to jump out here for a second and explain this and come back in, but one of the first places I as an architect, when I'm talking with the company, is how can I get started in this? Storage. Where are you storing your files? And one of the first things we do is try to get them off servers and move them into S3. Because that gives you a couple things. It gives you the ability, obviously it takes the load off your servers. It makes your servers stateless a lot of times. A lot of times it's just storage that's causing that issue. And so if that server dies on me, that's okay, because it's just cattle. I don't have to worry about it. I can bring it back up. It's not a loved pet. It's just a server that I can throw away. And so one of the examples that I do with Lambda, kind of come back around, is using storage and working against that storage. So when you drop, I have it where you drop a file in, an HTML file, and then the Lambda grabs it, PDFs it, and drops it somewhere else. And the Lambda, this is a plugin, using a Node plugin to create the PDF from it. And it does all that. I'm sorry. In this particular example that we're using, I actually do an HTML, but then it drops it into storage for you. And it kind of gives you this ability to do one. The idea of a microservice is you do one thing really well. And if you've done any kind of developing, that's an architectural standard. You want to break your stuff out. Single responsibility is what we call it, where that's all I do. And so using Lambda kind of drives that purpose in saying, okay, give me one thing to do as a microservice, and I'll do that really well. And so in that example, you do the markdown, it creates the HTML, you save it, and then it gives you a link to a PDF document. And that's all it does. And it only runs when you send that out. It doesn't require a server be up. It doesn't require anything, so you don't pay for anything but just those milliseconds.
That function.
Exactly. And the cool thing about AWS, and I wish I knew the number, but I think you get the first million milliseconds for free. Don't hold me to that. It might be different. But a lot of people, will realize that, man, I pay next to nothing. If I have a low bandwidth site that's just used for utility stuff, it's basically free.
Well, and the other piece of that is that tinkering becomes absolutely free. If you want to just play with the tooling so that you can understand what is possible,
Right.
you're going to be able to without any additional cost.
That's right.
It's the kind of thing that you've got production running, it's doing its thing, and you've got a new project that's in the back of your mind, causing you to want to scratch that itch. Go ahead. And that's one of the things that I think maybe gets underutilized in the cloud is the ability to verify a potential solution.
Yeah.
It used to be really prohibitive to be like, okay, we're going to have to sit down with everybody in procurement. We're going to have to talk through the specs, and this is all just for testing. That's so painful, I'm not going to worry about it. At this juncture, there's no reason not to go test and verify a new technology, a new solution, a new feature, because it is so inexpensive to just throw something out there and see what happens.
Yeah.
We talk about that through the entire gamut of any cloud portfolio. I mean, if you want to spin up, a GPU server to see, what bang for the buck am I going to get? Spin it up, run some benchmarks, and pull it back down. It didn't cost you very much to get massive horsepower and verify the results you'll get. If you want to test serverless architectures, create a bucket and throw some HTML in there, see if it meets the needs that you have, see if you can get what you need out of it. If you need to go a step further, build out a couple of Lambda functions and see how well that achieves your goals. It's not going to cost you anything to run a couple of Lambda functions just to see what happens. That's free. The time you have to spend, but you have to spend that anyway. And if it's not going to cost you anything, go and kick tires, find out what this brave new world looks like, because the costs are really negligible compared to the potential value you can pull out of it.
Yeah. I think it makes a lot of sense. Again, as a developer, that's always been a drawback in. I run everything local, or I used to. Everything's local because I've got it all on my Mac. I'll spin up the servers I need or whatever. But how do I show that to somebody? When I did a lot of private contracting, maybe 10% of those people I actually met. Most of them were somewhere else in the world. And so, all right, I'll run a Linux box out on this host, or I'll, that, and it's tedious. It's stuff I don't want to deal with. I learned Linux. I love Linux. Don't get me wrong, but I learned it out of requirements.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, I don't have a network
really
guy, so I'll learn how to do it.
But,
yeah, exactly. So. And then I got to patch it, and then I got to, because I don't want AWS yelling at me because it's been compromised, or anything like that, or and I've been using AWS since the classic days, and so and I have gotten in trouble before when I first started learning all the stuff, and so AWS is the perfect tinker world. I agree with you, and you can't beat that.
Yeah, it's definitely worth the time spent, because you may uncover a massive amount of value, and it's at least an efficiency play, right? You're going to have to do those things anyway if you're going to have a server do it, or you're going to find a way to get a serverless solution in place. You have to have that thing happen for your application regardless. And so go and tinker and see if you can't create overhead on your servers. That's been the name of the game, is how do we run servers as efficiently as possible.
Right.
That's why we developed virtualization. Like, I've got this giant box that I'm only using a certain amount of the time. Let's virtualize it. And then containers are, let's get more value out of the same real estate, the same piece of hardware. And you want to create more and more efficiency, but you also want to be sure that you can buy that overhead so that you can scale. And in the cloud, that's maybe an additional server. But if you can take work off of the plate of a device, that's huge, because that means that device can do a large amount more of the one thing you've tasked it with, instead of the litany of things. And that's where having a single server do all the things has become passé, because there's so many additional approaches, philosophies that you can apply to your application that get you away from that, so you don't have contention on a server, or single points of failure, all these concepts that we talk about all the time. Well, these are great ways to move that direction if you've got some legacy solution that is getting the job done but is creating headaches.
Yeah, and that's really where you balance, cost and time versus efficiency, and okay, how much is it going to cost me to upgrade this? How much is it, what's the time factor? Well, when I'm all done, man, I'm efficient and I don't have to do it again, or at least not for a long time, and it's worth evaluating.
Yeah, repeating the same process over and over and over again manually is one of the more infuriating things out
Yes.
there. You want to be able to automate anything you can, and so that's definitely a huge part of that conversation. We've actually from Facebook, we've got Ankit trying to get some more information about drawbacks. So he's asking, are there any drawbacks to performing transactions from Lambda functions? So we've talked glowingly about Lambda, but we always bring up this conversation of there's a right tool for the right job.
Right.
So let's talk about some of those use cases where you may not want to drive a nail with the wrench.
So, I mean, obviously, the glaring one is, does it support the language you want to use? If you're a PHP guy, it's not going to work for you. Other things are, if you do need to render for some reason, if you're a Node guy, which Lambda does support Node, but you need the tools that are available in, let's say, Express that handles a lot of, the routing or different things built in. With Node, one of the things I learned when I started, with Lambda, one of the first things I learned was you really kind of strip down your code. You're not going to. I'm not going to spin up Express inside of Node because that's overkill. And you want to look at how many milliseconds am I using? Do I load that up every time? There's also some, and I wouldn't call them gotchas. They were gotchas to me as I was learning it. In that, there's some specific ways that AWS handles Node and handles how Lambda's going to look at things. For example, their kind of the way their conformity is that you use a handler function. And if it loads in the handler function, that's going to load up every time and run. But if it loads outside of that function, it's going to get cached in memory. So if you're using an object or something outside, and the way I set it, and I won't go real deep in this, but the way I set it up is I have one little file called index that has my handler function, and it looks at the action and then loads up the right file so that I can kind of use it as an API, and it's like a CRUD. Okay, if I'm creating, I'm reading, I'm updating, I'm deleting, I have a different file for those to kind of keep my code clean, and those load in memory and stay in memory, and I didn't know that. And that really, and so I was getting duplicates all over the place, and I was getting things, and I go, man, and I'm like, Lambda's cache is all messed up. I was mad, and then I did some reading. I was like, oh, and it makes sense. I mean, it's a really smart way to do it. It's almost as if the more your Lambdas use, the faster it goes. Right. But those are things that, and it's not necessarily a reason not to use Lambda, but you definitely want to understand it as you use Lambda.
Well, I appreciate you going into that. I think the question about where are the drawbacks is indicative of a lot of the conversations that we're going to have with customers.
Right.
We talked earlier about the time that it takes to get up to speed on a new technology. When you're working with a partner like Rackspace, who, I mean, you've identified potholes. Like,
yeah.
I did it the way I assumed you needed to do it, found out that wasn't ideal, and now I approach things differently. That's the same pothole that Ankit or any other person would have run into had they come to this technology on their own. But because they get to talk it out with an architect or someone who's done this themselves, you get the value of someone calling out, you don't want to try it that way. I've tried it that way. It doesn't work. It breaks. It's frustrating. Get the most value out of it by going at it this other direction.
That's right.
And that just it paves that road more smoothly so that you get where you're wanting to go more quickly with less headache. And so that's really a great component of partnering with someone who's got the experience. Because you get to ask those kinds of questions, and it's certainly not the only thing to keep in mind, but it's a great example. And being a Node guy, you're able to bring that forward. But someone else who's coding in another language may may have a totally different set of requirements, and they'd talk to us and we'd say, oh, well, actually for your use case, look at it in this way.
Yeah.
And so thanks for sharing it and bringing that experience and expertise to the table. That's kind of indicative of the conversations that we'll be having in more one-on-one context when customers bring us their requirements.
Yeah,
So,
definitely.
thanks for the question.
One other thing I would throw out on that is, from a development standpoint, it's still a little, for lack of a better term, it's a little clunky because your code has to run on AWS. So if I'm local, if I'm sitting on an airplane, that's not going to work. You know what I mean? Unless I have wireless. But there are some attempts at building some local node, like NPMs that will run. I've not seen one that's reliable yet. But one of the things is, if you have a development team, there's some complication in sharing those lambdas. So if I'm working on one and Bob's working on one, because they may be versioned locally in my code, and you can version up on Lambda, so you can work against different versions. But it's not as simple as running Mongo and Apache local and just being able to version and then merge later. So there's definitely some complications, and I'm sure those will get around those at some point. My answer to it is I just work alone. I'm just kidding. My answer to it is I use a lot of automation tools. I use Gulp, and I've written some Gulp functions that like with mine, I deploy my lambdas through Gulp. So I prep a lambda and copy in some shared files, and then I'll actually push it with Gulp. And so that's handy, but that would stomp on somebody else's code. And so right now in this particular instance, I am working on my own some of these applications. But as you start to work with others, that's where it can, from a development standpoint, that's where it can get a little clunky, and you kind of need to work through that. I don't think it's a reason not to develop with Lambda, but it's certainly something to look at, especially if you're needing to be extremely quick. There's some things you want to look at up front, and definitely use those, the gulps, the grunts, the run, the node runners, things like that, to get that going.
Well, thanks.
Yeah.
Anybody else who has questions, feel free to shoot them our way. Anybody else has comments, we're appreciating your live interaction with us. But we've really been covering the work that Eric's done on these 3 blog posts about how to take advantage of serverless architectures on AWS. And those 3, he's kind of finished up that set, but there's going to be some follow-up. Let's talk a little bit and maybe tease what that next post and the next bit of serverless approach might be that Rackspace is interested in sharing.
Absolutely. So one of the things we're looking at, in my post, I interact with my Lambdas all directly through the SDK. Now, it uses an API. I mean, in the end, it's a REST API call, but it's not one that I've built. It's Amazon one, and it's based on my ID and that kind of stuff. But let's say you want other people to be able to consume your API. Let's say you've written a Lambda, it does some stuff, and you want a mobile app to be able to consume it, but you don't want to, you somebody else's mobile app, and you don't want to have to deal with the SDK or anything like that. So we're going to build out a blog point on wrapping your Lambdas with the API gateway. AWS has a serverless API gateway where you can create a REST API or wrap it around anything. I mean, a lot of different things, Lambdas and different things. And so that there's some security you can wrap it. I mean, as usual, security there. There's some mapping. You have a lot of control that you can handle that you might do at like an Express level or a Java level or something like that you can do right at the dashboard, and so with that, then we can expose this API out to the world without having to give them or require that they use the SDK or give them our authentication keys or anything like that.
Well, that's going to be exciting. There's definitely increasing value on letting somebody else handle a larger and larger percentage of the components required to do your day-to-day development. And we've talked about a lot of those things here. I'm sure this conversation will continue to extend into other products and other features that get rolled out at Amazon, at Microsoft, at Rackspace, in any of these cloud providers. There's all of these technologies that people use every day, and the more that you use something, the more you start seeing the things that that's nice, but it's really a headache to have to maintain it. And so that conversation is going to drive more and more serverless solutions and features. And I'm curious to see where that next spot might be. I can't currently conceive of a way to go more granular than we're at, but I've been surprised and blown away by the things we've gotten, the point we've gotten to now. So we'll see if somebody can continue blowing our minds. Tyler thinks it's nanobots, so we'll see how that goes. But that kind of gets us to the end of the hour. Anybody who's hung with us for the hour, thanks for joining. Anybody who's found this in the future and watched through the whole thing, thank you very much. We're excited about the future of technology. What we're doing today is really bringing our expertise to bear against customer problems. What are you trying to solve? How can we help you? So Eric is one of the guys you may end up talking to if you're trying to get more value out of AWS, get your solution built as efficiently as possible, deliver against your goals, and do so ideally. We've seen a lot of people do a lot of things. We've tried a lot of things ourselves, and so all of that expertise piles up, and we can bring it to the table in our conversations with customers, with you, on how to get the most out of those tools. So Eric, thank you so much for joining. Thank you for spending your hour and taking the time to share your expertise.
Yeah, man, I enjoyed it a lot. Thank you for doing this.
Oh, absolutely. I've got single digits of battery percentage left, so we need to bail before we're kicked out. But thank you so much for joining, everybody, and we will be back next week with more.
Bye, guys.